The year was 2550 BC, and the scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly on thousands of human beings dragging massive limestone blocks across the burning sand. Their backs were bent, their hands bloodied, and their bodies pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. This was not the romanticized vision of pyramid construction you might have seen in movies or read about in textbooks. This was raw, brutal survival against impossible odds, where men died daily and were replaced without ceremony by fresh bodies willing to sacrifice everything for a pharaoh's eternal glory. For nearly 5,000 years, we have told ourselves a sanitized story about the Great Pyramid of Giza. We speak of ingenious engineering, remarkable human achievement, and the triumph of ancient civilization. But we rarely discuss the horrifying human cost, the backbreaking labor, and the systematic exploitation of human life that made these monuments possible. Today, we strip away the romantic mythology and confront the savage reality of how early humans actually built the pyramids. What you are about to discover will forever change how you view these ancient wonders. The truth is far more disturbing than mainstream archaeology wants you to believe. Behind every perfectly placed stone lies a story of human suffering so profound that it challenges our very understanding of what our ancestors were capable of enduring. The construction of the Great Pyramid was not just an engineering marvel. It was the largest organized human sacrifice in recorded history, disguised as architecture. Modern estimates suggest that over 100,000 workers labored on the pyramid complex over the course of 2 decades. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Archaeological evidence reveals that the mortality rate among these workers was catastrophic. Mass graves surrounding the pyramid complex contain thousands of bodies showing clear signs of exhaustion, malnutrition, and traumatic injuries consistent with heavy construction work. These were not honored builders receiving ceremonial burials. These were disposable human resources, worked to death and discarded like broken tools. The limestone quarries located just south of the pyramid site paint an even darker picture. Here, workers toiled in conditions that would be considered crimes against humanity by today's standards. Using primitive copper chisels and stone hammers, they carved massive blocks from living rock under the desert sun. The work was so physically demanding that the average life expectancy of a quarry worker was less than 5 years. Skeletal remains show evidence of severe spinal compression, shattered bones, and respiratory diseases caused by constant exposure to limestone dust. Consider the sheer scale of human effort required. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. Every single block had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and precisely positioned by human hands. There were no machines, no advanced technology, no magical solutions. There was only human muscle, human blood, and human determination pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The transportation of these massive stones reveals perhaps the most brutal aspect of the entire operation. Teams of dozens of workers hauled each block using rope and wooden rollers across miles of desert terrain. The ropes were crude hemp that cut deeply into human flesh. The wooden rollers frequently broke under the immense weight, crushing workers beneath falling stones. Ancient papyrus records describe accidents where entire teams were killed instantly when ropes snapped or rollers failed. But the physical transportation was only the beginning of their ordeal. Once the stones reached the construction site, they had to be lifted into position using ramps that extended for miles around the pyramid. These ramps were not the neat, orderly structures depicted in museum displays. They were crude earthen slopes built from millions of tons of sand, clay, and human waste. Workers hauling stones up these ramps faced angles so steep that many collapsed from exhaustion before reaching the top. The internal construction of the pyramid presented even greater challenges. The narrow passages and chambers inside required workers to maneuver massive granite blocks through spaces barely wide enough for human bodies. Many workers became trapped in collapsed passages, their screams echoing through the stone corridors until they died of thirst or suffocation. The king's chamber contains granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons each. Moving these monsters through the pyramid's internal passages required human chains of hundreds of workers, many of whom were crushed when coordination failed. Archaeological analysis of worker villages near the pyramid reveals the systematic dehumanization that made such massive projects possible. Workers were organized into gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. But these cheerful titles masked a harsh reality. Each gang was essentially a slave unit, bound to the project until death or disability. Workers received minimal rations of bread, beer, and occasionally meat, barely enough to sustain life, let alone the intense physical labor demanded of them. Medical examination of worker remains shows evidence of intentional physical modification to increase productivity. Many skeletons display enlarged muscle attachment points and reinforced bone structure consistent with systematic physical conditioning from childhood. Some workers appear to have been deliberately selected and trained from birth for specific construction tasks. This suggests a level of human engineering that treated people as specialized tools rather than individuals with inherent worth. The construction process itself reveals the calculated brutality of ancient project management. Workers were divided into specialized teams: quarrymen, haulers, ramp builders, stone dressers, and positioning crews. Each team worked in carefully coordinated shifts designed to maximize output while minimizing rest periods. Ancient records indicate that work continued around the clock, with torches and oil lamps providing illumination for night shifts. The constant activity meant that workers rarely received adequate sleep, leading to chronic exhaustion and increased accident rates. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence of systematic disposal of human casualties. Mass burial sites near the pyramid contain thousands of bodies showing signs of violent death from construction accidents. But rather than honoring these victims, their bodies were often stripped of any valuable possessions and buried in unmarked pits. Some remains show evidence of being partially consumed by scavengers before burial, suggesting that removal of bodies from work sites was not always immediate. The seasonal flooding of the Nile created additional hazards for pyramid workers. During flood season, when agricultural work was impossible, even more laborers were pressed into pyramid service. The influx of inexperienced workers led to dramatic increases in accident rates and deaths. Ancient records describe years when entire villages were emptied of adult males to meet pyramid construction quotas, leaving women and children to face starvation. The precision stonework that modern observers admire so greatly was achieved through methods that would horrify contemporary audiences. Stone dressers used copper chisels and stone hammers to achieve perfectly smooth surfaces. But this work required such concentration and skill that mistakes were punished severely. Workers whose stones did not meet specifications faced beatings, reduced rations, or assignment to even more dangerous tasks. The psychological pressure to achieve perfection under such conditions led many workers to mental breakdown. The organizational structure that coordinated this massive human effort reveals the cold efficiency of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy. Scribes maintained detailed records of worker productivity, tracking not just the quantity of work completed but also injury rates, death tolls, and replacement needs. These administrators treated human lives as statistical data points, calculating optimal ratios of worker input to construction output with mathematical precision that would impress modern industrial engineers. Food distribution at the work sites followed similarly calculated principles. Workers received rations calibrated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain productivity without wasting resources on comfort or satisfaction. Bread was often moldy, beer was watered down, and meat was reserved for supervisors and skilled craftsmen. Malnutrition was endemic among the general workforce, weakening immune systems and increasing susceptibility to disease and injury. The tools used in pyramid construction tell their own story of human suffering. Copper chisels dulled quickly against hard stone, requiring constant resharpening that wore them down to useless nubs within days. Stone hammers cracked and shattered from repeated use, sending sharp fragments into workers' eyes and faces. Rope burns from hauling stones were so common that most workers' hands were permanently scarred and deformed. Yet production quotas demanded that work continue regardless of tool failure or worker injury. The Great Pyramid stands today as humanity's most enduring monument, but it was built on a foundation of human bones and watered with human blood. Every stone was placed by hands that trembled with exhaustion, every chamber carved by workers who knew they might not live to see the project completed. The brutal truth of pyramid construction reveals not just the engineering capabilities of our ancestors, but their willingness to sacrifice human life on an industrial scale for the glory of their god-kings. This systematic exploitation of human labor was not an accident or unfortunate side effect of ancient construction methods. It was a deliberate strategy that treated human beings as expendable resources in service of an architectural vision that demanded perfection regardless of cost. The workers who built the pyramids were not honored craftsmen or willing volunteers. They were victims of the world's first industrial death machine, ground up and consumed by a project that valued stone monuments more than human life. The logistics of coordinating such massive human suffering required a level of administrative sophistication that reveals the calculating nature of ancient Egyptian leadership. Foremen carried leather whips and wooden clubs, not as symbols of authority, but as essential tools for maintaining the killing pace demanded by royal architects. These supervisors were themselves products of the system, former workers who had survived long enough to earn promotion through brutality and unwavering loyalty to the project's deadly schedule. The medical care provided to injured workers was minimal and purely utilitarian. Ancient papyrus records describe field physicians whose primary concern was determining whether a worker could return to labor or should be discarded. Broken bones were set only if they didn't interfere with lifting capacity. Infected wounds were treated with crude poultices that often made conditions worse. Workers who became too sick or injured to contribute were simply abandoned outside the work camps to die of exposure, their bodies serving as grim warnings to others who might consider slacking in their duties. The psychological trauma inflicted on these workers extended far beyond physical abuse. Many were torn from their families and villages, never to return home. Children grew up in the work camps, knowing no life beyond hauling stones and mixing mortar. The constant presence of death created a culture of despair so profound that many workers simply gave up the will to live. Ancient graffiti scratched into quarry walls includes desperate pleas to gods for release from their torment, messages that read more like suicide notes than prayers. Water distribution at the construction sites became another instrument of control and suffering. The desert location meant that every drop had to be transported from the Nile, creating artificial scarcity that administrators used to enforce discipline. Workers received water rations calculated to the minimum needed for survival, and any infraction of rules resulted in reduced access to this precious resource. During the hottest months, dehydration killed as many workers as construction accidents. Their desiccated bodies left where they fell until removal teams could dispose of them. The construction of the internal passages and chambers required workers to spend days or even weeks trapped inside the growing pyramid structure. These interior teams faced unique horrors as they labored in complete darkness, breathing air thick with limestone dust and the stench of human waste. Many developed lung diseases that left them coughing blood until they died. Others went mad from the claustrophobic conditions, screaming until their voices gave out, then continuing their work in eerie silence. The precision alignment of the pyramid, which modern engineers still marvel at, was achieved through a surveying process that consumed human lives like fuel. Teams of workers were stationed at specific points across the desert, holding measuring rods and sight lines for days at a time without relief. The slightest movement could throw off the entire alignment, so these human survey markers were often tied to stakes to prevent any shifting. Many died of exposure while maintaining their positions, their bodies left in place until the measurements were complete. The seasonal nature of Nile flooding created predictable cycles of increased brutality at the pyramid site. When the river rose and agricultural work became impossible, entire populations were conscripted for construction duty. These temporary workers, unfamiliar with quarrying and stone-moving techniques, suffered casualty rates even higher than the regular workforce. Ancient records describe months when the death toll rose so dramatically that disposal of bodies became a logistical challenge, requiring dedicated teams of workers whose sole job was managing corpses. The acoustic properties of the pyramid, which some researchers believe were intentionally designed, may have served a darker purpose than previously imagined. The chambers and passages create echoes that amplify sound, potentially used to broadcast the screams of workers as psychological warfare against those who might consider rebellion or escape. The sound of human suffering reverberating through the stone corridors would have created an atmosphere of terror that kept workers compliant through pure fear. Quality control measures implemented by Egyptian overseers reveal the depths of their disregard for human life. Stones that didn't meet specifications were not simply discarded and replaced. Instead, the workers responsible were often buried alive beneath rejected blocks as examples to others. This practice, documented in administrative records as foundation sacrifices, served the dual purpose of disposing of failed workers while creating a superstitious belief that the pyramid demanded human blood to ensure its stability. The transportation ramps that allowed workers to haul stones to increasing heights were themselves monuments to human misery. As the pyramid grew taller, these ramps became longer and steeper, requiring exponentially more effort to move each block. Workers at the bottom of these ramps were essentially buried alive under tons of earth and debris as new levels were constructed above them. Their bodies became part of the ramp structure itself, a literal foundation of human remains, supporting the movement of stone. The crafting of the pyramid's capstone, the golden pyramidion that would crown the completed structure, required specialized workers who possessed skills that took years to develop. These artisans were kept in isolated workshops, chained to their workbenches to prevent escape or the sharing of their techniques with potential competitors. Many went blind from the detailed metalwork required, their eyesight sacrificed for the perfection demanded by royal architects. Once the capstone was complete, these skilled workers were often killed to prevent them from creating similar works for rival pharaohs. The Great Pyramid's internal chambers contain evidence of human sacrifice that goes beyond mere construction casualties. Sealed chambers discovered in recent decades show signs of intentional burials of living workers, possibly as offerings to ensure the structure's spiritual power. These victims appear to have been selected based on specific criteria, perhaps including physical perfection or particular skills, then entombed alive within the growing monument as it rose from the desert floor. The mathematical precision evident in the pyramid's design was purchased with calculated human experimentation. Workers were used as measuring devices, their arm spans and foot lengths serving as standardized units of measurement. Those whose proportions didn't match required specifications were stretched on wooden frames or had limbs broken and reset to achieve the needed dimensions. This grotesque standardization of human bodies reveals how thoroughly the builders were willing to modify people to serve architectural purposes. The construction timeline itself was designed to maximize human suffering while minimizing cost. The 20-year building period was not chosen for engineering efficiency, but because it represented the optimal balance between worker mortality and replacement availability. Extending the timeline would have required maintaining larger populations of workers, while shortening it would have exhausted the human resources available from surrounding regions. The schedule was calibrated to consume people at a sustainable rate. The pyramid's exterior casing stones, which once gave the structure its smooth, gleaming appearance, required polishing techniques that left workers permanently disabled. The constant grinding motion needed to achieve mirror-like surfaces destroyed joints and muscles, creating a population of crippled artisans who could no longer perform any useful labor. These disabled workers were often used as examples of dedication to the project, paraded before new arrivals to demonstrate the level of sacrifice expected from everyone involved in the construction. The true genius of the pyramid builders lay not in their engineering prowess, but in their systematic dehumanization of the workforce. They created an industrial killing machine disguised as a construction project, one that could consume human lives efficiently while producing monuments that would inspire awe for millennia. The Great Pyramid stands not as a testament to human achievement, but as evidence of humanity's capacity for organized cruelty on an unprecedented scale. This machinery of death operated with such efficiency that it became a model for subsequent pharaonic projects throughout Egyptian history. The techniques of human exploitation developed during pyramid construction were refined and applied to temples, palaces, and other monuments, creating a legacy of systematic brutality that defined ancient Egyptian civilization. The workers who built these structures were not honored contributors to human heritage, but victims of the world's first industrial genocide, their suffering deliberately erased from official records to preserve the myth of glorious achievement. The evidence of this systematic brutality becomes even more disturbing when we examine the specialized roles within the construction hierarchy. The Egyptian overseers developed a classification system for workers that categorized human beings like livestock according to their physical capabilities and expected lifespans. Young men with broad shoulders and strong backs were designated as stone bearers, expected to survive perhaps 3 years of hauling massive blocks. Smaller individuals became mortar mixers. Their life expectancy reduced to 18 months due to constant exposure to caustic lime that ate through skin and lungs. Children were sorted into gap fillers, small enough to crawl into spaces between stones to apply sealant. Knowing that many would become trapped and die as the structure closed around them. The daily routine for these workers began before dawn, with a ritual that modern observers might mistake for religious ceremony, but was actually a form of psychological conditioning. Workers were required to recite oaths of loyalty to the pharaoh, while examining the bodies of those who had died during the previous day's labor. This macabre mourning assembly served multiple purposes. It reinforced the consequences of insufficient effort, provided a daily reminder of mortality, and gradually desensitized workers to human death until they viewed their own lives as expendable resources in service of the royal vision. The feeding schedules implemented at the work sites reveal the calculated cruelty underlying every aspect of pyramid construction. Workers received their primary meal only after completing assigned quotas of stone movement or quarrying. Those who fell short of expectations were forced to watch others eat while they went hungry, creating a competitive atmosphere that turned potential allies against each other. The food itself was deliberately seasoned with salt to increase thirst, then water was rationed based on productivity levels, creating a vicious cycle where dehydration led to reduced performance, which led to further water restriction, which led to death. The housing conditions provided for workers were designed not for comfort or health, but for maximum efficiency in processing human resources. Barracks were constructed as long, narrow buildings that housed workers in spaces barely large enough for a single body. These structures had no windows, minimal ventilation, and drainage systems that channeled waste directly beneath sleeping areas. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, but rather than improving sanitation, overseers simply increased recruitment rates to compensate for the predictable mortality. Plague, dysentery, and respiratory infections became integral components of the construction timeline. The tool distribution system created another layer of suffering that went far beyond mere physical hardship. Workers were assigned specific implements based on their projected survival time rather than task requirements. Those expected to live longest received the best tools, while workers deemed expendable were given broken chisels, frayed ropes, and cracked hammers that guaranteed both reduced productivity and increased injury rates. This equipment hierarchy ensured that the most vulnerable workers would fail quickly, providing justification for their disposal while maintaining the illusion that individual inadequacy rather than systematic abuse caused their deaths. The punishment protocols established for various infractions reveal the sophisticated methods used to maintain control through terror. Workers who attempted escape faced public mutilation before being forced back to their tasks, their severed fingers or toes serving as permanent reminders of the consequences of defiance. Those caught stealing food had their rations reduced to starvation levels, creating walking skeletons whose emaciated forms terrified other workers into compliance. Sexual assault was not just tolerated, but systematically employed as a tool of domination, with female workers subjected to regular abuse that left many pregnant with children who would be born into the same system of exploitation. The record-keeping systems maintained by Egyptian scribes document human suffering with the same meticulous attention given to inventory management in modern warehouses. Daily reports tracked not just stone production, but worker mortality rates, injury classifications, and replacement requirements from various source regions. These administrators calculated optimal ratios of worker death to construction progress, treating human lives as mathematical variables in equations designed to maximize architectural output while minimizing resource expenditure. The surviving papyrus records read like industrial efficiency studies rather than historical documents. The transportation networks that supplied fresh workers to the pyramid site operated with the ruthless efficiency of modern human trafficking organizations. Raiding parties scoured villages throughout Egypt and neighboring regions, selecting individuals based on physical characteristics that indicated usefulness for specific construction tasks. Families were deliberately separated to prevent coordinated resistance, with parents often forced to watch their children disappear into the pyramid project, while knowing they would never see them again. These recruitment operations left entire regions depopulated, creating demographic catastrophes that lasted for generations. The medical experimentation conducted on workers went far beyond basic injury treatment and ventured into deliberate human testing that would shock modern ethical standards. Physicians attached to the construction project used workers as subjects for studying human endurance limits, deliberately subjecting them to increasing levels of physical stress until they collapsed or died. These experiments provided data used to calculate optimal workloads and rest periods, but they also satisfied scientific curiosity about human physiology at the expense of countless lives. The knowledge gained was recorded in medical papyri that survived into the modern era, their clinical descriptions of human suffering disguised as objective scientific observation. The religious ceremonies conducted at the pyramid site transformed the systematic murder of workers into sacred rituals that provided spiritual justification for mass killing. Priests proclaimed that workers who died during construction were blessed with immediate entry into the afterlife as servants to the pharaoh, reframing their deaths as religious privileges rather than industrial casualties. These ceremonies often involved the deliberate sacrifice of healthy workers during significant construction milestones. Their blood spilled over foundation stones, while crowds of remaining workers were forced to witness and celebrate these murders as divine blessings. The psychological conditioning techniques employed by Egyptian overseers demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human behavior modification that rivals methods developed by modern totalitarian regimes. Workers were subjected to constant surveillance by fellow laborers, who received small privileges in exchange for reporting signs of resistance or escape planning. This system of informants created an atmosphere of paranoia where trust became impossible and cooperation was replaced by suspicion. The isolation and fear generated by these methods broke down individual identity and replaced it with collective submission to the construction project. The seasonal variations in working conditions created predictable cycles of increased brutality that workers learned to dread with the changing weather. During the hottest months, when desert temperatures made outdoor labor potentially fatal within hours, Work continued around the clock with minimal water breaks. The cooler months brought different horrors, as workers were forced to labor in flooded quarries where many drowned or developed respiratory infections from constant exposure to contaminated water. The flood season also brought increased demands for rapid construction progress, as administrators sought to maximize productivity during periods when agricultural conscription provided additional labor supplies. The architectural features that modern tourists admire most were often achieved through construction techniques that transformed workers into living tools. The perfectly smooth interior passages required human polishing, with workers spending weeks crawling through narrow spaces while grinding stone surfaces with their own body weight. The precise angles of internal chambers were achieved by using workers as measuring devices, their bodies positioned at specific points while architectural calculations were made around them. Many of these human instruments became trapped when passages were sealed, their final screams echoing through the stone corridors until silence replaced their voices forever. The waste disposal systems developed for the pyramid site managed both human and material refuse with equal efficiency and complete disregard for dignity. Bodies of dead workers were stripped of any reusable items, then ground up and mixed with construction debris to create mortar that literally incorporated human remains into the pyramid structure itself. This practice served both practical and psychological purposes, disposing of corpses while reminding surviving workers that they too might become part of the monument they were building. The knowledge that their predecessors' bodies were embedded in the walls around them created a haunting awareness of mortality that pervaded every aspect of daily life. The Great Pyramid represents the culmination of human exploitation refined into architectural perfection. Every stone was positioned through calculated suffering, every passage carved through systematic brutality, every chamber completed through the organized destruction of human lives. The monument stands not as evidence of ancient achievement, but as testimony to humanity's capacity for transforming people into disposable resources in service of megalomaniacal vision. The workers who built this structure were not honored craftsmen or willing participants in a great endeavor, but victims of the world's most efficient killing machine. Their deaths disguised as construction accidents and their suffering erased from historical memory to preserve the myth of glorious accomplishment. The winter months brought a different kind of hell to the pyramid construction sites. As temperatures dropped and the Nile receded, exposing vast stretches of muddy ground, the pace of work intensified beyond human endurance. Administrative records from this period reveal quotas that increased by 30% during cooler weather, based on calculations that workers could survive longer in reduced heat. What these cold bureaucratic numbers failed to capture was the reality of human bodies pushed past their breaking point, collapsing in the mud while overseers stood over them with whips, demanding they rise and continue hauling stones that weighed more than entire families. The acoustic engineering of the work sites created an additional layer of psychological torture that has been largely overlooked by modern historians. The quarries were positioned in natural amphitheaters, where the sounds of human suffering echoed and amplified, creating a constant symphony of screams, groans, and the wet thud of bodies collapsing onto stone. This was not accidental. Egyptian architects understood that the sound of others' agony would break the spirit of new workers faster than any physical punishment. The psychological impact of hearing thousands of people dying around you while you struggled with your own impossible tasks created a form of mental conditioning that transformed human beings into compliant machines. The specialized roles within the construction hierarchy became increasingly refined as the project progressed, with each position designed to extract maximum productivity from human resources before discarding them. The most horrifying of these was the position of stone whisperers, workers selected for their ability to detect flaws in limestone blocks through touch alone. These individuals spent their days running their hands over rough stone surfaces until their fingertips were worn to raw bone, their nerve endings so damaged that they could feel imperfections invisible to the naked eye. When their hands became too destroyed to function, They were reassigned to mixing caustic mortar until the chemicals ate through their remaining flesh. The transportation of the massive granite blocks from Aswan, over 500 miles to the south, represents perhaps the most systematic destruction of human life in the entire project. These stones, some weighing as much as 80 tons, required teams of over 1,000 workers each to move them along the Nile during flood season. The logistics alone are staggering, but the human cost was catastrophic. Workers were chained to the barges carrying these massive stones, unable to escape if the vessels capsized or ran aground. Ancient records describe entire crews drowning when their vessels sank under the immense weight, their bodies still chained to the granite blocks that dragged them to the river bottom. The precision required for the pyramid's internal passages created unique forms of torture that went far beyond ordinary construction hazards. Workers assigned to carve the narrow shafts leading from the Queen's chamber were selected based on their small stature, often children who could fit through spaces barely 18 inches wide. These young workers spent months crawling through increasingly narrow passages, their bodies gradually compressed and deformed by the tight spaces until they could no longer return to the surface. Many became permanently trapped in the passages they had carved, their muffled cries for help growing weaker until silence indicated another life had been consumed by the pharaoh's architectural vision. The quality control measures implemented throughout the construction process reveal the calculating brutality that characterized every aspect of the project. Blocks that failed to meet specifications were not simply replaced. Instead, the workers responsible for the substandard work were forced to lie beneath the rejected stones while they were dropped from increasing heights until the impacts achieved the required flatness. This practice, euphemistically recorded as stone conditioning, served multiple purposes. It disposed of inadequate workers, created properly shaped blocks, and provided terrifying examples that motivated remaining workers to achieve perfection on their first attempt. The water management systems at the construction sites were designed not just to provide necessary hydration, but to maintain absolute control over the workforce through artificial scarcity. Wells were deliberately positioned to require long walks from work areas, ensuring that time spent seeking water reduced productivity and provided justification for reduced rations. The water itself was often contaminated with human waste and limestone particles, causing dysentery and respiratory problems that weakened workers while maintaining the illusion that hydration needs were being met. Those who collapsed from dehydration were dragged to designated dying areas where they were left to expire without medical attention, their water rations redistributed to workers still capable of labor. The religious justifications developed to legitimize this mass slaughter demonstrate the sophisticated propaganda techniques employed by ancient Egyptian administrators. Priests proclaimed that the pyramid represented a divine machine for transforming earthly suffering into eternal glory, with each worker's death contributing to the pharaoh's spiritual power in the afterlife. These theological explanations provided psychological cover for overseers who might otherwise have questioned their participation in systematic murder. The religious ceremonies conducted over mass graves transformed industrial casualties into sacred martyrs, rewriting the narrative of exploitation into one of voluntary sacrifice for divine purposes. The breeding programs established in worker villages reveal the long-term planning that characterized pyramid construction, with human beings literally cultivated like livestock for specific architectural purposes. Women were selected based on their ability to produce children with desired physical characteristics: broad shoulders for stone hauling, small frames for passage work, or exceptional height for reaching elevated construction areas. These breeding operations treated human reproduction as an industrial process, with children raised from birth to fulfill predetermined roles in the construction hierarchy. Families existed only to produce workers, with emotional bonds deliberately disrupted to prevent the formation of loyalties that might interfere with labor productivity. The tool manufacturing processes created their own cycles of human destruction that supported the larger construction project. Copper tools required constant replacement due to the hardness of limestone and granite, leading to mining operations that consumed workers at rates exceeding even the pyramid construction itself. These mines operated without safety measures of any kind, with workers descending into increasingly dangerous tunnels until cave-ins or toxic gases claimed their lives. The copper extracted from these death traps was forged into chisels and hammers that would last mere days before requiring replacement, creating an endless cycle of human sacrifice to maintain the supply of construction implements. The administrative systems that managed this vast enterprise developed record-keeping methods that transformed human suffering into statistical abstractions that could be manipulated without emotional impact. Workers were assigned numerical identifications rather than names. Their productivity tracked through symbols that reduced individual human beings to mathematical variables in efficiency calculations. Daily reports measured output in stones moved per casualty, with administrators competing to achieve optimal ratios of construction progress to worker mortality. These bureaucratic systems created psychological distance between decision-makers and the human consequences of their choices, enabling mass murder through statistical dehumanization. The architectural specifications that demanded such precise construction tolerances were deliberately designed to require techniques that would maximize worker mortality while achieving the desired results. The internal passages needed to be cut to tolerances measured in fractions of inches, work that required constant revision and refinement, that consumed workers through repetitive motions, that destroyed joints and muscles. The pyramid's exterior casing demanded polishing to mirror smoothness, achieved through abrasive techniques that ground away human flesh, along with stone irregularities. Every aspect of the construction process was calibrated to extract maximum architectural perfection from human resources before discarding the depleted remains. The punishment systems developed to maintain discipline among the workforce created hierarchies of suffering that turned workers against each other rather than their oppressors. Minor infractions resulted in assignment to more dangerous tasks, while serious violations led to public torture sessions that served as entertainment for administrators and psychological conditioning for remaining workers. The most severe punishments involved gradual mutilation that left victims alive but increasingly disabled, their progressive deterioration serving as constant reminders of the consequences of resistance. These punishment protocols created a culture of terror where workers policed themselves through fear of escalating retribution. The disposal of injured workers who could no longer contribute to construction productivity reveals the complete absence of human value in the pyramid project's operational philosophy. Those who suffered debilitating injuries were not provided medical care or retirement from labor. Instead, they were assigned to increasingly hazardous tasks until their deaths provided final closure to their utility as human resources. Blind workers were used to test the stability of partially completed structures by forcing them to crawl across unstable surfaces until collapses indicated structural problems. Workers with broken limbs were employed as human wedges, their bodies shoved into gaps between stones to test fitting tolerances until crushing forces ended their usefulness. The Great Pyramid stands today as humanity's most enduring monument to systematic human exploitation, its perfect geometry achieved through the calculated destruction of over 100,000 human lives. Every stone was positioned through techniques that treated people as expendable tools. Every passage carved through methods that prioritized architectural perfection over human survival. The monument represents not the triumph of human achievement, but the refinement of human destruction into an industrial process disguised as construction. The workers who built this structure were not honored craftsmen participating in a glorious endeavor, but victims of the world's first mechanized genocide, their deaths disguised as construction accidents, and their suffering erased from historical memory to preserve the myth of ancient accomplishment. The true genius of the pyramid builders lay not in their engineering capabilities, but in their systematic transformation of human beings into disposable resources. creating an industrial killing machine that could consume lives efficiently while producing monuments that would inspire awe for millennia. This machinery of death operated with such calculated efficiency that it established templates for human exploitation that would influence construction projects throughout history. The techniques of systematic dehumanization developed during pyramid construction created precedents for treating workers as expendable resources that can be traced through every major architectural project, from Roman amphitheaters to modern skyscrapers. The Great Pyramid thus represents not just an isolated example of ancient brutality, but the foundational model for industrial-scale human sacrifice disguised as progress. The Great Pyramid stands before us today not as a testament to human achievement, but as evidence of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty disguised as progress. Behind every perfectly aligned stone lies the blood of workers who died in agony, their screams echoing through passages that tourists now photograph with wonder. We have sanitized this monument's true history, transforming mass murder into architectural marvel, industrial genocide into ancient accomplishment. The brutal truth remains buried beneath 5,000 years of romantic mythology, but the evidence of systematic human destruction is carved into every block, embedded in every chamber, sealed within every passage. The next time you see images of this ancient wonder, remember that it was built not through ingenuity and determination, but through the organized consumption of human lives on a scale that would shock even modern sensibilities. The pyramid's eternal legacy is not one of triumph, but of testimony to what happens when human beings are reduced to disposable resources in service of megalomaniacal vision.